It was a cold night in Los Angeles. The rain had begun to fall in torrents, drenching the streets and turning the city into a blur of lights and shadows. John Anderson, a well-known millionaire and businessman, was driving carefully down the slick roads, his grip firm on the steering wheel. Beside him, his wife, Sarah, sat in the passenger seat, her smile soft and warm despite the storm outside. In the back seat, their 8-year-old son, Ethan, was fast asleep, his little head leaned against the window, his breath fogging up the glass, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. The city lights flickered in the distance as John drove cautiously through the storm. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand, offering a quiet reassurance. The sound of the rain pounding against the car's roof was nearly deafening. But inside the car, there was a sense of peace, family together, going home after a lovely dinner. It was an ordinary evening, one that felt like it would pass without incident. But fate had other plans. As they rounded a curve on the freeway, a truck appeared out of nowhere, barreling into their lane. John's heart raced as he instinctively swerved, his mind racing, but the wet asphalt betrayed him. The car skidded, the tires lost traction, and the world around him spun uncontrollably. The sound of metal crumpling was deafening, followed by the sickening crash of glass shattering. The last thing John heard was Sarah's scream, a sound that echoed in his mind long after the accident. Everything went black. When John woke up, the world was eerily quiet. The sterile smell of a hospital filled his nose, and he blinked slowly, trying to make sense of his surroundings. His head ached, and his body felt like it had been struck by 1,000 hammers. He tried to sit up, but his strength failed him. The last thing he remembered was the accident, the truck, the crash, Sarah screaming. He reached up, his hand brushing against the bandages on his head. And that's when the truth hit him like a freight train. His mind spun as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He was alive, but Sarah was gone. The doctors had told him that much. His wife, the love of his life, had died in the crash. The grief was unbearable. But it wasn't just Sarah's death that consumed him. Ethan, his son, his only child, had disappeared. No one knew where he was. The authorities had searched for days, combing through the wreckage. But there was no sign of Ethan. It was as if he had vanished from the earth. They assumed he had been thrown from the car, but no trace of him could be found. The loss of his wife was devastating enough. But losing Ethan, his precious boy, was a blow he could not begin to comprehend. For weeks, John remained in the hospital, a shell of the man he had once been. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. His grief was so overwhelming. It felt as if the world itself had turned against him. He never spoke to anyone, not his brother David, who had come to visit him countless times, not the doctors, not even the police officers, who continued their fruitless search for Ethan. After being released from the hospital, John retreated into his mansion, shutting himself off from the world. He refused to attend any funerals, to meet with any of his friends or family. He couldn't bear the thought of facing the reality of his life. His once thriving business empire, which had been built through years of hard work and determination, now seemed meaningless. He had everything: wealth, power, success, but none of it could bring back the family he had lost. Months passed, and the empty house grew colder, quieter. His brother David tried to reach out to him, to offer support, but John pushed him away. He didn't want help. He didn't want anyone. It was easier to wallow in the dark, to exist in a world where he didn't have to face the overwhelming weight of his grief. And then, as if the universe had dealt him another cruel blow, John received the news that would change his life forever. The doctors told him that, due to the accident, he would never be able to have children again. The news hit him like another punch to the gut. His dream of having a family, of rebuilding his life, was shattered. He would never have another child. John sat in his grand office that evening, staring out over the city. The skyline of Los Angeles stretched out before him. The bright lights of the city, a stark contrast to the darkness inside his soul. His mind wandered back to his son, Ethan, wondering where he was, whether he was alive, and if he would ever see him again. But instead of succumbing to despair, John made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would not give up. He had too much to offer, too much to live for. So, he chose to channel his grief into something positive. He began using his vast fortune to help others. He donated millions of dollars to build schools, hospitals, and orphanages in impoverished areas of the United States. It was the only way he knew how to cope, the only way he could feel like he was doing something meaningful with his life. But despite all his charitable work, something still gnawed at him. The void in his heart remained. He wanted someone to pass on all the knowledge and wisdom he had gained throughout his life. He needed someone to teach, someone to love. And so, after years of trying to fill the emptiness, he decided to visit orphanages, hoping to find a child who could be the heir to his wealth, his empire, and his teachings. It had been 15 years since the accident. John, now 55, had made a name for himself not only as a businessman, but as a philanthropist. His hair, once dark, was now streaked with gray, a visible testament to the passage of time and the hardships he had endured. But his search for an heir remained as strong as ever. On a hot summer day, John visited the Hope and Life Orphanage in Los Angeles. It was here, amidst the laughter of children and the hopeful smiles of the staff, that he would find the person who would change his life forever. As he walked through the halls of the orphanage, John felt a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Would he find the child he had been searching for all these years? Would he be able to move past the haunting memories of his wife and son and embrace a new future? Only time would tell. John's eyes fluttered open. The harsh light of the hospital room seemed too bright, and the sterile smell of antiseptic stung his senses. His head throbbed. His body ached as if every bone had been broken and then put back together with no care. He tried to move, but pain shot through him, and he froze. He tried to focus on his surroundings, but nothing felt familiar. The beeping of a heart monitor in the corner of the room was the only sound that seemed to make sense. Slowly, a vague realization began to seep into his mind. He wasn't alone. A figure stood by the window, staring out, as if waiting for something. His brother, David. David, John croaked, his voice hoarse. David turned, his face etched with concern. John, you're awake, he said, rushing to his side. How do you feel? John tried to sit up but collapsed back onto the bed, feeling like he had been hit by a truck. His brother helped him adjust the pillows and settled down beside him. Where's Sarah? Ethan? John managed to whisper, his voice trembling with fear. David's face darkened, and the smile faded from his lips. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. John, I'm so sorry. Sarah didn't make it. His words hung in the air like a weight, heavy and suffocating. John's world began to spin once again. No, no. John gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. But Ethan, where is Ethan? David's silence was deafening. The seconds stretched into an eternity as John searched his brother's face for any sign that he was lying. But there was none. His worst fear was coming true. We couldn't find him. John, he's gone. The police searched for weeks. They couldn't find any trace of him. John's mind shattered, the pieces of his thoughts scattering into oblivion. He felt numb, as if his body was no longer his own, as though it had abandoned him to bear this unbearable weight. Ethan, his little boy, was gone, and Sarah, the love of his life, gone in an instant. John lay back on the hospital bed, his eyes wide, staring at the ceiling as the tears began to fall. His life was over, reduced to fragments of memories. He could still remember Ethan's laugh, the warmth of Sarah's touch, the sound of their voices, but all of it was now just a distant echo, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. The days that followed were a blur. John was released from the hospital with little more than broken bones and bruises, but his soul was shattered beyond repair. David tried to help, offering words of encouragement, but none of them reached John. He refused to speak to anyone. He couldn't face the world. Months passed in a haze of silence and grief. John's company continued to run in the background, his wealth growing as his absence became a normal part of the business. David took on more responsibility, overseeing meetings and handling decisions as John withdrew further into his own pain. The mansion where they had once lived as a family now felt cold and empty. Every room, every corner, every inch of space was a reminder of what had been lost. And then came the news, the medical report that changed everything. A specialist, one of the top doctors in the country, had informed John that he would never be able to have more children. The accident, the injuries sustained in the crash, had left him infertile. The words were a cruel punch to the gut. Another reminder of his helplessness, his inability to fix anything. He could never have the family he had dreamed of. He would never get to teach Ethan how to drive, or walk him down the aisle on his wedding day, or see him grow into the man he was meant to be. John felt as though the weight of the world had crushed him. His heart seemed to stop with every passing day, each moment more painful than the last. But in the midst of his despair, something inside him shifted. A voice, deep within, whispered that he couldn't simply give up. There was something he had to do, something he had to give. For the first time in months, John rose from his bed and stood before the mirror. His face was hollow, his eyes bloodshot and red from crying. But there was a glimmer of something in him, a glimmer of purpose. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he knew he couldn't let his wealth and knowledge die with him. He had to do something to honor Sarah and Ethan's memory. He couldn't bring them back, but he could leave behind a legacy. That was when John decided he would spend the rest of his life helping those who had no one, children without families, those who had been abandoned and left to fend for themselves. He would use his fortune to build schools, hospitals, and homes for orphans. He would adopt a child. He would teach them everything he had learned about life, about love, and about overcoming the toughest of challenges. But even as he made this decision, John couldn't help but feel that it would never be enough. Nothing could ever replace what he had lost. And yet, deep inside, he knew that he had to try. And so, with a heart still broken but determined to find healing, John began his new mission. Little did he know, this journey would lead him to the one person who would change his life forever. A child who would help him heal, and perhaps even give him a new sense of hope, setting the stage for the upcoming chapters in his journey. Would you like me to continue with part 3? John's heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. He could barely comprehend David's words. Gone. Ethan, his little boy, gone. The same boy who had filled their home with laughter, joy, and boundless energy. The same boy who had been taken from him in the blink of an eye. No, John whispered again, his voice barely audible. The weight of the grief settled in, a suffocating fog that clouded his thoughts. Sarah, his beautiful wife, the woman he had loved more than anything, lost in a crash. Ethan, their son, just 8 years old, lost to the world. He felt his body go numb, as if all the life had drained out of him in that instant. The pain was so sharp it cut through him like a blade. He wanted to scream, to rage against the world that had taken everything from him. But the tears wouldn't come. All he could do was lie there, in that sterile hospital bed, staring up at the ceiling. David sat beside him, silent, giving his brother the space to process. They didn't speak for a long time. Neither of them had the words. What could they say? There was nothing that could make this pain go away. Nothing that could bring back the loved ones they had lost. But as time passed, John knew that there was something he had to do. His grief was consuming him. Yes, but it was not enough to bury him. He had to move forward, had to find Ethan, wherever he might be. He's out there, John thought. I can't just let him disappear. The doctors told him that he needed time to recover, that his injuries were severe and he shouldn't push himself too hard. But John had no intention of lying in that bed while the world moved on. He had to find his son. Weeks passed, and John slowly regained some strength. He was discharged from the hospital, though the physical pain was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. He found himself wandering through the house that now felt so empty. Without Sarah, without Ethan, it was like a hollow shell. He needed answers, desperately. David, John said one afternoon as they sat at the kitchen table, nursing cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. I'm going to find Ethan. I don't care what it takes. I can't live with the uncertainty. I can't just wait around for something to happen." David looked at him with a mixture of concern and fear. "John, I know how much you want to find him, but you can't go after this alone. We don't know where he is. We don't know if he's even alive." "I don't care," John snapped, slamming his fist on the table, his voice raw with emotion. "I can't sit here, helpless, not knowing what happened. I won't." David fell silent, watching his brother with growing understanding. After a long moment, he sighed. "Okay, we'll do this together, but we need a plan. We need to be smart." And so began the search. It was all-consuming. Days turned into weeks as John, with David by his side, combed through every possible lead, every possible connection, trying to find any trace of his son. The police had been helpful at first, but with no new leads and no evidence, their investigation had slowed to a crawl. John knew that if he wanted answers, he would have to look elsewhere. It was late one night, nearly 2 months after the crash, that the breakthrough came. A phone call, out of the blue. "Mr. Collins?" the voice on the other end asked. "I believe I have information about your son." John's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this? What do you know?" The man on the phone gave a name John had never heard before. "I've been following a lead. There's someone who might know where your son is." It was a long shot, but it was something. With David's help, they tracked down the man's information. And within days, John was on a plane, heading to a small town on the outskirts of Chicago. He had to know the truth, even if it tore him apart. When John arrived in the town, he was led to a dilapidated house on the edge of a rundown street. The man who had contacted him was waiting for him on the porch. A rough-looking man, dressed in a worn-out jacket, his face lined with age and regret. "Mr. Collins," the man said, extending his hand, "I know this is a long shot, but I think you're looking for the right person." John could hardly contain his anticipation, his chest tightening with every word. "Tell me everything," he urged. The man led him inside the house, where a series of photographs lined the walls. And there, in the middle of them, was a picture of a young boy, Ethan. John's breath caught in his throat. The man explained how, after the accident, he had found a boy wandering the streets, lost, confused, but alive. And now, months later, the boy had been living with a kind-hearted woman who had taken him in. John's heart raced as he listened, the hope he had tried to suppress bubbling to the surface. He was closer now, so close. The journey to find Ethan wasn't over, but it had taken a turn for the better. John knew that he still had much to do, much to uncover. The road ahead would be long, and the pain of loss would always be there. But he finally had a glimmer of hope. His son was out there, and he would find him. As John made his way to the small house where Ethan was being cared for, he realized that the search for his son was not just about bringing him home. It was about redemption, healing, and rebuilding the shattered parts of himself. The grief would always be there, but it didn't have to define him. His son, his family, were worth every moment of the journey. And when John finally stood at the doorstep of that house, knowing that the search was nearly over, he took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same determination that had carried him this far. He had found a new reason to live,